Today at the monastery, I read a book by the Cistercian abbot and hermit Andre Loof, and he spent a lot of time among Orthodox monks. It's a book of his called The Way of Contemplation, and yeah, I really enjoyed it. I don't have it on me right this second, but the experience of having read it is 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 resonating with me at the moment, and I thought I'll make a video while there's no strong winds and while I'm on this little monastic walk. So he's got a chapter on on basically just pilgrim notes on a pilgrimage, and then a chapter on ecumenism, monastic ecumenism, which kind of neatly follows on. He talks about his initial first encounters with orthodoxy through a Romanian Orthodox monk who comes to stay at their Trappist monastery in France, and a strict monastery and all the rest of it. And they're deeply edified by this Romanian monk, and this leads to a bunch of them eventually going over to Mount Athos. And he relates very vividly his encounters there on Athos with monks, with scholarly monks and prayerful monks, and even one hermit called Paisius. And I'm wondering, I wonder if that's Saint Paisius, before he was made a saint, as it were. Everybody was telling him at the time, you must go and see this man, you must go and see him. He's probably already waiting for you to come and see him. And that this Paisius had been saying to people that if any Latin monks come, if any Roman monks come from the West, send them to me, and we will understand each other quite well. So I'm wondering, would that be the famous Saint Paisius? But then he relates that over about a page and a half and two pages, and the great joy that encounter gave them, as they felt like young children in with a true spiritual father who treats them very lovingly and very kindly, and escorts them back to where they need to be personally after their encounter. Let's go bit by bit. The whole thing starts when this Romanian monk comes on the scene and to the Trappist monastery in France, and he participates in their way of life, in the choristry prayers, and in Latin, etc. And they're very impressed with his ways, and eventually the abbot's not there, but the prior takes it upon himself to say, look, will you give us a talk in the evening? So he gives this half an hour talk, and they think, well, that's not enough, we want more. So for the whole week, he gives his evening talks, and the monks are all enthralled, and they're asking for his blessing and just getting on great. And well, then the book leads on to his trip to Athos, and his encounter with orthodoxy has a huge impact on Andre Loof. He wrote a book called Teach Us to Pray, which is all about prayer of the heart, incessant prayer without ceasing, etc. You can see the influence of the Philokalia tradition in his spirituality, going beyond the head to the heart, as it were, to interior prayer, quiet, hesychastic prayer. On Athos, he recounts quite with good humour and clarity how a lot of monks will take it upon themselves, almost like a rite of passage. When we see a Latin monk, we're to tell them that they're heretics, we're to tell them that they should grow beards, that their sacraments are invalid, that they're not properly baptized. But then when they get beyond that, generally these monks will settle down and will respond very kindly to being asked, how do you pray? Or enter into the conversation, and will be really surprised, oh, how can you Latins be interested in prayer? how can you Latin monks be interested in the interior life as we are? And some of them can be really overjoyed at seeing that, wow, there's something left in the Latin monastic tradition to rejoice about. He laments that, many of the Westerners who go there are, little more than tourists who are just hastily doing the rite of passage the few days away from wives that they've left on the shore, who are not allowed to go to the island, and that some of these only serve to consolidate the prejudices against Western monks or Western Christians, that they're overly intellectual, superficial, etc. He also says he quite forgives any antagonism. Not antagonism, because they're all highly edifying in their hospitality towards these Latin monks. But he forgives their misgivings towards the Latin monks, because he says they haven't had any contact with them hardly. And, many of these Athonite monks are very simple living people, and the only understanding they have is of the Latin Church is their own prejudices, really. Of course, some of those prejudices are well-founded. But there's a beautiful sense in André Louf's book of monks meeting from across traditions and being gently surprised and edified together. Sitting at a table together, sharing ideas, sharing a common vocabulary, clearing up some of these prejudices, and encountering the Holy Spirit praying within each other from opposite sides of the table. There's some beautiful stories of encounter. Monasteries where the relics are brought out of various saints that have died on Mount Athos, and the Latin monks say, look, can we sing one of our ancient Latin hymns that we would normally sing for these occasions, in optima persona or something like this, and they put the request in, and then they realize, I'm not sure if that's allowed on Mount Athos, these heretics singing these hymns, but they allow it, and then they reflect that this is probably the first time there's been Latin hymns, and it's sung by Latin monks for centuries and centuries, maybe the 13th, 14th century, when the schism wasn't so, shall we say, entrenched. For we are told there was still Latin monks and a Latin monastery on Mount Athos up until I think it was the 14th century, in spite of the formal schism of the two churches. There's very much a sense of the possibility then, as he carries into the second chapter, of spiritual ecumenism, of an ecumenism of the Holy Spirit, a meeting of minds and of prayer. This is arguably easier in the Catholic tradition, which does allow its members nowadays to pray with baptized Christians of other traditions. But it's also possible where, such as the example here of Latin monks just turning up and the Spirit blowing where he wills and doing what he does. He does give the example of one Athonite monastery where they said, look, you Catholics, you can't enter here because we're so fervent, because it's a very fervent monastery, strict. So they weren't allowed to take part in any of the liturgies or the prayers. But having said that, he said they were exemplary in their hospitality and insisted that the monks, these Catholic monks, stay to have lunch with them and to eat with them. And so there we go. I think that's all I wanted to really say about that encounter, and just how, I think he uses the phrase that the East must find its West and the West must find its East. These two great traditions, these two great churches have so much to share. And how he talks, I could relate to this, how it's edifying for Latin monks and Latin monastics who are perhaps suffering from lack of vocations. Not every Latin monastery, of course, Catholic monastery is, but some certainly are in the west of Europe, where secularization is really cut deep. And he says they can really be edified by going to these Romanian monasteries that are like he talks about almost like a Latin orthodoxy because of the strong Latin roots of Romania. Or Mount Athos, where he also visited. And, you know, he talks about that can really edify Roman Catholics, because we're like, wow, you know, this same spirit as we have in our church, working in a completely different tradition that I knew so little about. And that's exactly how my wife and I felt when we first went to Essex Monastery in England, that we felt like, wow, they're just like us. And we remember some of them saying it about us. We were just like them. And this can edify people to say, we're not alone here. The Spirit is blowing in a very similar way in other corners of the world. Well, I'm just rambling at this stage, but it's a fantastic book, well worth a read. André Loof, In the Way of Contemplation. I'll put the picture of it on the video.